Thanks for being here, Angela, and everybody else on the call. Really excited to learn about DSOs, which is completely new to me. I would also like to thank Alison for bringing Angela to us so that she can present today. And yeah, Angela, let us know, what the format is going to be. As usual, everybody, please feel free to make it participative, ask questions as you go. And yeah, Angela, you have the floor.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And yeah, everyone, I think I'll go over the agenda a little bit. Please feel free to come off mute and ask questions and interrupt me. And also, Ben, maybe if there are questions in the chat, I don't know if I'll see them with my presenter view. So if you could also bring those to my attention, that would be helpful as well. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. My name is Angela Kent. I am the Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs for Energy Hub. And I am here today to talk about distribution system operators and the Ontario context. I recently attended through the DER task force an event in Ontario that explored the implications of potentially adopting a distribution system operator model for the province for its accommodation and enablement of DERs and a distributed energy future. It was a really exciting event with a lot of interesting conversation, and I think for all those who are interested in how we all move toward a distributed energy future, exploring DSO models is a pretty interesting thing. So today we are going to go through a little bit of background for Ontario. I don't know about the attendance, but I personally am absolutely not an expert in Ontario's regulatory regime, so learned a little bit about it through this event, and we'll share that with you for some stage setting. I'll contextualize the gathering that happened in Ontario and what brought us here today. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit with some explanations of the DSO models that have been explored in Ontario, and then open it up to discussion. So hopefully most of this time will be spent conversing, and I do not pretend to be the world's expert on distribution system operator models whatsoever. So I am really excited to hear from all of you and just to exchange. So to begin, we're going to look at what's going on in Ontario a little bit. Just some, I guess, level setting for the attendees. And I think I'm imagining that a lot of the people here work in the United States. And so I think that there are some key differences with the way that they kind of operate their grid and manage their electric system that are important to have in mind. So generally speaking, there is the Ontario Board of Energy, the IESO, and the Ministry of Energy that are the major players in the administration of electricity writ large. Big sector policy and major procurement decisions are made by the provincial government. The planning and management responsibilities of the bulk electricity system are taken on by the IESO. It's the independent system operator in Ontario. There's a hybrid market, so there is both direct and competitive procurement of resources. Sometimes those are directed by the provincial government, sometimes those are undertaken by the IESO. There are some bulk system assets that are rate regulated by the Ontario Energy Board, which if you work in the United States, you can think of as the regulatory commission that oversees the utilities. There is a distribution system made up of about 60 LDCs. Those are the utilities that are all overseen by the OEB. And I think the key distinctions to make for those who work in the United States are that in Ontario, the IESO is both the bulk system operator and the load serving entity for the entire province. So all residents, all customers in the province are served by the IESO, and the utilities, or the LDCs, are the distribution owners and operators. So it's a little bit different from the various models that exist in the United States. There has been a lot of really good work going on in the province around the kind of broad recognition of the fact that there's probably going to need regulatory reform to accommodate the proliferation of DERs. the Ministry of Energy, the OEB, the ISO, all are undertaking and have undertaken initiatives to expand a number of supportive frameworks. There's a conservation and demand management framework, which I think would probably most closely mirror energy efficiency or demand side management portfolios in the United States. There have recently been updates to non-wires alternatives processes. They have a regulatory innovation sandbox. There are many funding opportunities for piloting different technologies that enable DER integration. And there are also a few distribution system operator pilots underway. If you're not familiar with DSOs, don't worry, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that the challenges surrounding the enablement and adoption and integration of DERs in Ontario are unique given the differing roles played by the LDCs or utilities and the IESO. Utilities are not the load serving entities, and so the responsibilities are spread across these entities just like they are in the United States. So there are certain considerations that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about who should manage DERs, who should be responsible for enabling them, et cetera. And the potential associated with distribution system operator models to provide a clearer path forward to DER integration has come to the forefront of a lot of this conversation in the province. And now I will give a little bit of context for the event that led to the conversation that we're having now. So there are a lot of great organizations doing very cool work in Canada. One of these is the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, which, because I do not represent them, and I'm going to just read to you what their description is. They are the voice for wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage solutions powering Canada's future. They work to create the conditions for a modern energy system through stakeholder advocacy and public engagement. They have diverse members that are all uniquely positioned to deliver on clean, low-cost, reliable, flexible, and scalable solutions for Canada's energy needs. And so the Canadian Renewable Energy Association facilitates something called the Electricity Transition Hub, or just the Hub, which is a program that seeks out national and international resources. It tailors those to specific Canadian electricity and system operator contexts to expedite the 2050 net zero economy. And, you know, in my experience with this event, really serves as a kind of important and targeted convener of stakeholders grappling with challenging issues. And so the Canadian Renewable Energy Association was the host of this event in Ontario. As I said, there's a lot of momentum behind DER integration in Ontario. And I think that this event was a reflection of that. The Canadian Renewable Energy Association brought together attendees from, I guess, all kinds of stakeholders in the energy system. So international and domestic DSO and smart grid project experts and proponents, utilities in the province, the system operator, nonprofits, government researchers, the provincial government and OEB staff, and many other industry stakeholders. So essentially, this event really served to give all of the engaged stakeholders in Ontario an opportunity to openly discuss what a distribution system operator model means, what it means for all of those different entities respectively, what benefits it could provide, what challenges it could pose to the proliferation and adoption of DERs in the province. And I think that, especially being there through the DER task force, I think that there are a lot of commonalities between the objective behind this event, which was to facilitate open discussion, and what the DER task force provides, which is really convening of a plurality of perspectives. And so today, I'm hoping to build on the conversation that was had there by providing a little bit of context around how certain actors in the province are thinking about DSOs in Ontario as a way to spur exploration. And I think that hopefully that will lead to some interesting reflections on, you know, similarities and differences between the context there and in the United States, how we might adopt some of these processes or ideas, and we can go from there. And I think the other thing that I want to, I guess, address before moving into the weedy part of this is that, like I said, I'm not the expert on the Canadian regulatory system. I'm also not the expert on a DSO. And I think importantly, I'm not taking a position, I would say, on the viability of, or prudency of any of these models. I think that they're really interesting to explore. and can help everyone in learning about them to understand, to maybe gain insight into different aspects of DER deployment and integration that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I am the neutral facilitator today, but I invite all of you to share your opinions. Before I move on, are there any questions? All right, well, feel free to interrupt me. So, in the fall of 2023, last year, the Ontario Energy Association, which is another big stakeholder in the province, in collaboration with EY and a working group of the utilities in Ontario, published a very comprehensive report on the potential of distribution system operator models in Ontario. So we're going to use this report to ground the discussion around DSOs as a jumping off point. I think neither I nor even this report pretend to be painting a totally comprehensive picture of what the DSO concept encompasses. And I think it serves as a really good basis for discussion, given the way that it addresses more than one model for a DSO and the way that it raises questions about the roles and responsibilities of market actors and decision makers as pertains to everything DER, our favorite subject. This white paper explores enablement of DER adoption through the evolution of the LDCs in the province toward more of a distribution system operator model. It outlines the benefits and characteristics of two separate DSL models, total and dual, which we will go over. And it's very thorough and considers requirements including the grid assets that are needed to enable this, technologies that are needed for enablement, kind of human capabilities that are needed, functional roles, responsibilities, and capabilities of the ministerial government, the bulk system operator, the LDCs, evaluates cost saving and cost recovery opportunities, and takes a look at what kinds of challenges would be avoided with the implementation of this model versus business as usual operations. A few, I guess, caveats that are included in the report. The report doesn't define a roadmap or implementation plan, so it's kind of exploring conceptually like what this looks like, but it doesn't say, here is how you go out and do this, because I think that this is really more of an exploratory kind of endeavor. It also doesn't outline what changes would be needed what changes we would need to make to the regulatory framework to enable something like this. Those are both very interesting questions that I hope that we're able to discuss, but won't be including any guidance in it. And I think, to reiterate, the report is exclusively dedicated to the potential of DSOs as enablers of a distributed energy future. That's not to say that there aren't other ways to do that, and that's not to say that there isn't already progress being made. It's really just kind of looking at this microcosm of that world. So what is a DSO? Great question. In the report, they define a DSO as being a real-time system operator for an active distribution network, which empowers customers and yields consumer-side and system benefits by coordinating and dispatching DERs at a local level. The DSO also acts as a neutral facilitator to open markets at the bulk and local system level to support the optimization of the bulk and local distribution systems. And for me, at least, coming from the United States context, I think the hallmark of this model in my mind is that you can almost think of it as an ISO, but at the scale of a utility territory for distribution system needs and potentially for bulk system needs as well. So kind of taking the ISO model that we're familiar with in the United States and saying, a utility or another entity is going to serve a lot of those roles in market facilitation and dispatch within their territory. Before diving into the two separate models that are explored specifically, there are some general roles and responsibilities provided. Again, the DSO is a neutral market facilitator and operator, and the DSO provides access to network and balancing services for market participants. They animate the ISO or bulk grid and local grid services concurrently or in a co-optimized manner. They articulate technical limits to participants before bidding. The DSO is not itself an aggregator or a market participant, but a facilitator of DER participation in a defined local distribution area. It's intended to support a more prosumer approach to participation in the marketplace. The DSO can theoretically support DER owners in accessing value stacking opportunities at the bulk level through the DSO or directly with the bulk system operator. And I think that's a really key distinction because in the United States, the IESOs aren't responsible for the provision of very locationally granular distribution grid services. And so the value stacking opportunity provided here is kind of like aligning those things all in one column or stack you could think of, so that, you know, participation in a market program doesn't mean that you're necessarily only responding to bulk grid conditions with your resource. Another thing to call out is that the report also, generally speaking, the report addresses DSOs as the LDCs themselves, but it also kind of highlights the fact that in places where LDCs are maybe not interested in or don't have the capabilities to act as the DSOs themselves, there's the possibility for one utility to act as a DSO for another service territory. And I think even in the broad umbrella of DSO concepts, that could also be a role taken on by an unaffiliated third party. So I think that really just highlights the fact that it's contemplated here as mostly being the LDC, but there are several different approaches. So beginning with the total DSO model, I'm not going to read this list of characteristics out to you, but I highly encourage you to skim through them. In the total DSO model, the DSO, likely the utility in this case, it takes responsibility for facilitating and optimizing the benefits that DERs can offer across distribution, transmission, and supply layers of the system. The TDSO would act as a single point of contact for customer dispatch of DERs into local markets, as well as wholesale markets, and they would also bear responsibility for providing greater visibility into the DER aggregations themselves. The utilities operating as total DSOs under this construct are responsible for managing the distribution network, coordinating DER services and operations, optimizing system performance, and facilitating market participation as market mechanisms evolve and grow to accommodate the full system value that DERs can provide. So if this is sounding like an American ISO to you, to some extent, that makes sense. So under this construct, DERs and DER aggregations would retain their ability to be totally independent in their commercial and contracting capabilities with the bulk system or otherwise. As the market facilitator, the utility would optimize the network configuration, as it would theoretically have full visibility of distribution conditions and needs, and has coordinated with the IESO prior to market opening and during dispatch to ensure the maximum number of megawatts in the markets. And I think that this will also become clear when I provide a comparison after this, but I'm going to pause for questions. Anything outstanding? Okay, all right, good. Y'all are just experts. Took me a few times to read through this. Okay, the second model that's explored in the report is the dual participation model. This model requires the DSO and the IESO or bulk system operator to dispatch resources separately for local and province-wide purposes, respectively, based on their contracts and contractual obligations to customers. Under this model, the bulk system operator, the DSO, and the utility, if it's not the DSO, they would work together to resolve system issues. There's a lot of complex communication and coordination required between the transmission and distribution system operators involved in this model, as well as third-party aggregators, because theoretically, there are two entities that are dispatching resources as opposed to one. Specifically, this coordination would likely often be limited to override functionality, since each system, since the bulk system and distribution system would be coordinated independently prior to going to market, let's say. The report highlights this as yielding less system optimization because the LDC is only informed after the fact of the bulk system DER interaction. So I think that's an interesting point that warrants further discussion. The bulk system would also, under this model, not have visibility into the operations of the network. So I think that the critical difference is, since each system is coordinated independently before going to market, there is greater coordination needed and maybe less visibility by all market participants into the availability of resources and things like that. So to make this distinction a little bit clearer, if you want to kind of look at these two frameworks next to each other, I'll just recap, I think, the different, like the characteristics of both. Under the total DSO model that is explored here, the DSO is a neutral market facilitator that coordinates, optimizes, and dispatches DERs on behalf of customers, local markets, and the distribution grid. And it also coordinates the dispatch of DERs into bulk system administered markets, while DERs and DER aggregators retain their ability to be fully independent in their commercial and contracting capabilities with the bulk system or otherwise. Under the dual participation model, DSO coordinates and dispatches DERs for both customers and the distribution grid, while the bulk system operator separately coordinates and dispatches DERs on behalf of customers and to deliver transmission and bulk supply benefits. And it relies on very extensive communication between all of these actors. And I'll probably come back to this for the discussion, but so I think that those are the key elements of, some of the work that has been done around the potential of the DSO model. Obviously, this perspective is, I think, key traits are that the report outlines a model where the utilities are the DSOs themselves, where there is potentially a division of responsibilities related to bulk system and distribution system dispatch and management and planning. And the larger planning and operational responsibilities that exist today would need to shift under either of these paradigms pretty dramatically. And I see that there's a question. Kumar, if you want to come off mic.
Hi, my name is Kumar Jala. I'm from Argonne National Lab. So we have been working on similar projects. So just to clarify the differences between two models. So in total DSO model, the DSO maintains the reliability of the system, but also operates the kind of distribution level market. Whereas in dual participation, the DSO purely responsible for reliability issues, but then aggregator would directly participate in the market. Is my understanding correct, or am I missing something?
I think that's mostly right. I think the simplest way that I can think to put it is, under both models described here, the DSO is operating a kind of like distribution level market that mirrors for distribution grid needs some of what a ISO would typically operate. So like, capacity, energy, depending on where you are in the world, like ancillary services, things like that. In both models, the DSO would be doing that for its service territory. In the total model, they would also be hosting a market and dispatching resources for the bulk system. So they would be dispatching resources not only like for the distribution grid needs, but also for the bulk system needs and optimizing everything as such. And under the dual model, they would exclusively be dispatching resources to address distribution grid needs, and the bulk system operator would be dispatching assets to address bulk system needs.
So then in dual participation model, an individual DER or the aggregator will have option to either participate in the DSO market or the ISO market. And do they have to choose, or they can dynamically arbitrage between them?
So I think the way that it's discussed in this report is that, or the perspective of the authors of this report, which include the Ontario Energy Administration, like I said, is that the dual participation model might constrain actors because there are conceivably challenges associated with, let's say, one resource being available to both the distribution operator and the bulk system operator, especially if dispatch signals conflict. So there is, I think, preference shown for the total DSO model, in that because only one entity would be dispatching resources for both needs and optimizing accordingly, the DER aggregator, let's say, would be able to access both. That's the way that it's put forward in this report to some extent. I think that the dual participation option is seen as more limiting for third parties and DER aggregations.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was very helpful.
First.
What would be the reason why they might want to go for dual participation then?
So they do explore kind of like benefits and challenges associated with both models. I think that there are, in either case, there's I mean, I can't speak for the authors of the report. In either case, I think that there is a very heavy technology lift. I mean, either way, you are having to, you know, you can almost think of it, at least the way that I think of it, is like, are you coordinating and exchanging data like before the fact, meaning dispatch for X reason, or after, right? Like in the total model, you're working together prior to, you maybe have like real-time lines of communication open so the DSO is able to dispatch for all needs. In the dual model, you are maybe after the fact understanding who dispatched what, or maybe there are override agreements if one entity needs to use a resource or a collection of resources otherwise. I think that I can imagine understanding the context in Ontario where the bulk system operator is the load serving entity and the market facilitator now, that like there may be value like from a provincial perspective to the retention of the bulk system operator as an independent entity that has access to resources without working through a DSO, but I can't really say what the overall driver is.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I think we can go back to this graphic if we need to, but I came up with a few questions. Like I said, my hope is for us to spend most of this time in discussion. So I am hoping that we have some talkative folks online. One of the things that I'm interested in hearing is if there's anyone on the call who has experience with distribution system operators. I know that at the event hosted by the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, we had an expert speaker come from the UK to talk about, you know, the transition that they made and what a distribution system operator model entailed for them from an operational perspective and from a political perspective. So I know that there are some places in the world where that is a currently functioning grid operations model, and I would love to hear from anyone here who has experience working there. I think I'd also love to hear reflections on how any of this maybe mirrors or has similarities with the systems in which you work. I know that there are definitely some parallels to the American context where there are system operators and utilities that have varying relationships to the system operator, but would also kind of love to hear reflections on those similarities as well. So I will pause for a few seconds and hopefully entice someone to bring their own perspective.
Well, it's very quiet, so I'll just ask about this last point on, do we need a distribution level market operations? Is that referring to smaller regional markets or something else? I guess I'm not quite understanding what that question is trying to address.
Yeah, sure. So I think when I wrote this out, what I was envisioning was, you know, the way that, at least in the American context, I think a lot of the services that might be provided by a DSO are provided today is through, maybe it's through a utility undergoing a non-wires alternative to address a discrete need at a certain point in time, or a utility like pulling its own levers, like maybe directly procuring certain like grid assets to handle unexpected events, or you know, to essentially manage distribution grid conditions. I know that non-wires alternatives and are like a big topic of conversation, and I think that what I'm getting at here is, instead of having the utility go and procure those things maybe directly or through like a sole source or all source RFP, is there value in having a utility instead facilitate a market where you're a DER aggregator, you can come and say, I have this resource, I can provide all of these services, I can provide ancillary services, they're here, and you know, have a market context where like there is a clearing price and things like that for distribution grid needs. So it's really just kind of, is that needed? Is the way that things exist today in much of the United States, is that sufficient? Is a market the appropriate mechanism for the provision of distribution grid services? So kind of trying to get at that.
That's really interesting. So if I'm understanding that right, that's more focused on like just that smaller distribution level, creating those marketplaces, and then the main players would be like the DERs within that. So instead of just like the DER selling, like a household with a solar panel selling back to a utility, they would have access to like more of a local marketplace. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think maybe just to give an example, like say that you know, you have a solar paired energy storage system that can do lots of cool things. And depending on where you live, they currently today have the ability to participate in to join an aggregation and be responsive to bulk grid signals, like participate in a wholesale market on that front and provide, let's say, capacity. You may also presently have the opportunity to participate in a utility program where a utility, maybe through its DSM portfolio, pays customers for access to their battery so that they can call on it when needed for their own purposes. And there might, but it is not available to you today, probably pending for 2222 to do both at the same time. And also the way that the utility procures those services, the way that you might participate in that utility program is generally through, you know, an RFP process that comes out of a demand side management portfolio. And the alternative would be that kind of aspect of utility planning would go away, and the utility would host energy capacity ancillary services markets that aggregators could bid into and be dispatched through accordingly. All right, if I have answered that question, I think Adam, your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm not by no means an expert. I guess my thought is that like maybe eventually, but like you know, we don't even have like a real market at the bulk services level yet. And so it's sort of like if this thing happens and the thing after it happens, then what will we do? And it's hard to, you know, it's hard for me to kind of responsibly like weigh in and say like this is the end state. It's more like how would we find our way from here to there? What would be the forces that you know that prevent us from doing that? Because I think like if I think you know with like at a local utility level there may be a localized constraint, right? Like we could say like, oh, you know, we can't enable this new development, or we can't let this new fleet operator come online because we don't have capacity. So at that moment, like it would be super valuable to have, you know, a DER aggregation like just like pop into existence and serve the need. But then, you know, 4 years go by and the utility like it, you know, expands its system, and now the value of that aggregation is much less. So it's difficult to create a market. It's, you know, it wouldn't be like a market of things that already exist. It would be kind of like a forward market for things that will exist for a certain amount of time until conditions change or something like that. So it's kind of a complex market. It seems more analogous to like the um, like like an integrated resource planning process seems to be like what's, you know, scaling down the integrated resource planning process, what they call like integrated distribution planning. That seems like a missing ingredient. Like until you've done some of these things and like gone through the steps and the utility has thought about things this way, I just don't see how a DSO could like spring into existence. So it seems kind of theoretical I can see why the total system model has some, you know, has some merits over the other model, but it also just seems kind of theoretical until a bunch of other things happen.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely is theoretical, or at least, you know, where we are in much of North America today. And I think absolutely, you know, see where you're coming from in terms of, you know, maybe seeing the value presently from the context of it would be great to have a DER aggregation pop up and resolve like a block or two interconnection. I think to your point about like integrated planning, this would, you know, one of the really important things to think about when we're envisioning DSOs is like, if the DSO is also the load serving entity, then there's an opportunity for all of the resources in its service territory to provide energy and capacity and, you know, discount its other procurement needs. So I think there is also the potential for a model like this to provide ongoing market participation opportunities. But yeah, I agree. I do think it's all theoretical at this point.
Well, that gets to kind of a different, you know, business model basically. Like, and that I think that's the, like, you know, looking at like the technical potential of a total DSO or a, you know, kind of a hybrid model that if, you know, regardless of like if you go down to the lowest level of the DSO, like what is that entity's incentive to kind of like set up an opportunity for a DER aggregation instead of like reconductoring a feeder or, you know, building a new substation, like until there's like an entity that is you know, neutral to those two alternatives. I think that's also kind of seems like kind of a precursor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely, I think, as it's contemplated here, there are major implications for like a transformation of the way that cost recovery is conducted today and a transformation of planning processes. Because, yeah, you're totally right. I think, you know, taking this concept and like plunking it down today wouldn't line up with current operations. So, yeah, definitely point well taken. I think, Robert, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to extend on that point because it was exactly where I was kind of coming from, is that we have a lot of these concepts in piecemeal today. So like if you look at VDER, if you look at like take a New York context, look at VDER, you know, CSRP, you know, dispatch windows for distribution, you know, constraint needs. You look at flexible interconnection out of California. Like a lot of these policy pieces seem to be trying to patch over what the DSO could align incentives on across each of those different elements. You know, for minimum load requirements, you have a minimum load on a feeder. You know, it's not a good time to dispatch DERs, like low value. When you stretch on the other side where you have a load condition that is now, you know, at a point that's breaking a feeder or is too much for a feeder, that's a high value opportunity for DER to switch on and a battery to dispatch. Like, you know, those are missing today, other than exactly what Angela said, which is very limited and blunt force tools to try to shed load or you know, induce, you know, incentivize, you know, generation at a spot. But you know, it's really hard to do if you don't actually have a real-time signal to do that, or you know, a capacity signal or whatever, you know, whatever you have it. Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. Like the big the big problem here is that I think the LDCs, the utilities today, are benefiting from that to a certain extent because they're rate basing those things, you know, today in an inefficient manner, which may not be bad for their bottom line, but is having rate impact. So, you know, the big question in my mind is, does the DSO model actually drive, you know, ratepayer savings, you know, through doing this implementation? But it seems it feels to me that it should, because it should be more optimal than the current things that we have to, and blunt tools that we have today, which I'm sure are not optimal.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think broadly agree broadly agree with like your general points, but what I will say is that I think, you know, again, there are different models here, and I think probably everyone here is familiar with the fact that like capabilities like these, they're not traditionally a part of like what the utilities job has been. And like, also to be fair, these are capabilities that didn't exist like very long ago. And so the legacy processes by which, you know, utilities operate within, or they're allowed to, the way that they're allowed to operate isn't necessarily conducive, like, you know, in the super advanced, like forward-looking iteration of like DER proliferation to the old model where there was like no load growth, not a whole lot of very exciting distribution activity. I think that this will probably also spur other questions, but I think that two of the things that stand out to me here are that in a lot of ways, like the DSO model is interesting because it leverages like it leverages the really granular data about distribution grid conditions that the distribution like network owner should have, and, you know, provides a different manner of understanding like how those services might be provided. But I'll also say, like, I do think at the same time, almost like separate from this conversation, that the blunter tools that exist that I think were born out of energy efficiency or DSM portfolios, those are also evolving rapidly too. Like there are lots of places, at least in the United States, that are, you know, assessing like flexible capacity needs or taking on more advanced integrated distribution system planning processes, maybe even merging legacy resource planning processes. So I think even in the absence of the implementation of a model like this, there is evolution just kind of like in a different direction. That's very positive. I'm seeing questions in the chat. Okay, Pete Fitzsimmons, I read through your question and I don't know that I necessarily understand what you're asking or commenting on. Do you want to come off mute and maybe explain?
Hey, actually, yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for the great presentation today. This is really helpful and understanding certainly the Canadian market and how it contrasts to the US market. I think back to Adam's earlier comments around, do we need a distribution level market operations? The curious thing that at least my team's observing is, you know, with the fragmentation of generating assets, with either solar or with PV or with battery storage or wind, et cetera, it's creating some really interesting new business models and opportunities for consumers. And I think in the many markets that I've had an opportunity to sort of participate in, energy is certainly a very new one for me. I'm a banker by trade, but you know, adoption tends to come from the bottom up. So to the extent that we have some exciting new programs around EVs and certainly third-party ownership of highly distributed assets that are on the generation and storage side, there are some really interesting things that we can do, quote unquote, sort of off-grid, as well as to be able to do some interesting distribution things within quote unquote virtual networks. So to the extent that we're better meeting the predictability, affordability, and the security needs of the consumer, and we're able to provide new business models that really drive innovation, I think at the end of the day, some sort of distribution level operation becomes a necessity if it doesn't automatically sort of evolve out of the meeting the consumer's demands and what they're interested in. So the fragmentation of generation and storage really is going to drive some interesting things there, at least from what we're seeing so far, which is very early stage. We're primarily developing and owning assets in the mid-market commercial space, PV and storage here on the East Coast of the US. And there's some really interesting things that we're talking to various groups around, providing some new opportunities for consumers to participate really actively in this demand response market, particularly with EVs, and developing sort of a community model around some of the some of the opportunities there. So that's where my question was, or response is more around that. At some stage, the fragmentation and the consumer will really be interesting in driving a lot of the changes that you're discussing here. And I know to date, a lot of the planning and a lot of the grid is a top-down approach, which reflects the fantastic ancient history of this thing. But that seems to be changing, at least in some of the experiences and opportunities we're exploring. So that's what I mean.
No, I appreciate the clarification, appreciate the example, and I definitely agree that, like, yeah, more advanced distribution system management is definitely inevitable. And I think, everyone knows that. Like, I think that is becoming more of an unavoidable truth. And I think, it's really interesting to see the way that all market actors are investing in different capabilities to enable that. Oliver, your hand is up.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I had kind of a comment or a question around how I'm struggling to picture how it would actually work in practice, kind of in that future state. Like, it seems to me that a lot of the benefits DSOs provide are like the more granular geographic level you go, the kind of the more additional benefit you're getting on top of like an ISO market. And like when you get more geographically granular, you also just don't have as much competition. And I kind of worry that like a market might be there might not be very much like liquidity and competition in a market when it's looking at, say, like an individual feeder. You're very dependent on like what providers are actually available to offer. Is there like one person, one company participating in that market, and then you don't really have the benefits that markets deliver. It feels to me, I mean, it's kind of related to Adam's point about it feels like there's a long way to get to a place where we have good competition at like such a granular level. And I don't know, have people thought about that? I've not read the report, but is that part of what's covered in the report? And then maybe like a second thought is just that, there are some pretty novel rate designs, like Vido was mentioned. And like California has some more advanced sort of rate designs that are transactive. And I'm sort of wondering about, contrasting a DSO model against those more advanced rate designs and what incremental benefit it brings.
Well, I will say I too am interested in that comparison, and I will look for that report. I agree that I'm very interested to understand, like, I would love to see some sort of like review of like the efficiencies associated with like, all of these programs as they're implemented, or like operational models as they're implemented, to better understand what wins out. I will say, to your point about the very granular local markets having very low liquidity, that's something that I have heard about. That's something I've heard from those with experiences in the UK, where as in, if you get super locationally specific with the service that you're providing, then you're limited to like the one asset that is there. And I don't think that like I think this exercise is not intended to resolve that. What I will say is that I think that, at least as it's contemplated, the benefits associated with having a singular entity optimize for bulk and distribution grid conditions, and having a singular entity with which like aggregations interface, is that you are expanding opportunities for those aggregations. That probably serves as a catalyst for continued proliferation. And generally speaking, you're expanding compensation opportunities for customers. So to some extent, and then additionally, you're increasing operational efficiency by ensuring that you are, by having access to the full suite of resources and having access to all of the information about conditions at all grid hierarchies, you can make the most informed decisions about what needs to be brought online and where. So it doesn't resolve the super granular question, but I do think that it's something interesting to take into consideration. I know that we're quickly running out of time, but Daisy, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really helpful. I was curious if the report goes into much of the kind of what you just touched on, some of the device competition elements on how the value is kind of influenced in terms of device types, either in the residential market versus the CNI market, how that's kind of being considered. Because I know in the US, for a lot of even the initial policies you've seen in this realm, that hasn't really been broached. So I'm curious to hear kind of some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the broader, even beyond this report, like the reason that I think one of the reasons that a DSO model has like come into like the conversation in the province is, you know, differential access for the different customer classes. And so if you do have an entity that is able to provide participation opportunities for customers that may not meet like bulk that may not rise to the threshold of being able to provide bulk grid services, that like essentially you do create an environment where more diverse customers are able to participate. Yeah, I think that is my, I'm trying not to be long-winded because we're short on time. So that's my quick answer. But I would love to discuss this more offline. Annalise, your hand is up.
Yeah. Hi, Angela. Great to see you. So I guess going back to kind of what Oliver was talking about in terms of if we're thinking about layering kind of an ISO on top of a DSO model, like from the perspective of an aggregator, probably one of those opportunities is going to get you a little more revenue than the other. So you're probably going to have to choose between them and do some difficult math. And like, obviously this is theoretical, like we're not thinking about the weeds of this right now, but that's the first thing that comes to mind of just like, one of those is going to probably like have more of a pull to aggregators. And so like DSOs might not even get off the ground if they're not super lucrative.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely good point. Like you're going to pursue whatever like makes your business model the most viable. If the only entity with which you like can interact for like services on both levels is the DSO, or for most of those services, then your choice is probably simplified to some extent. But then that you know that raises questions about, you know, loading order, what use cases are being addressed with what resources, and depending on how different resources are leveraged for different needs, how is compensation afforded differently. So I think that's a really, really, really good point. And especially that is probably something interesting to explore more for the dual participation model, where there is separate dispatch and separate system optimization with the DSO and the bulk system operator. All right, well, you guys asked a lot of great questions, and oh, we have one more. Okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, interesting. So Robert, do you want to come off mute and maybe contextualize your question, or I can read it out loud if not?
Yeah, I think I was just talking to the piece of, you know, is this going to be an efficient market? And in my mind, you know, it may be less of an efficient market than creating opportunities, you know, where none previously existed, and thus, you know, more utilizing existing resources through technology and market signals, rather than, you know, should one person be burdened with a, you know, distribution upgrade that then is, you know, completely socialized to the rest of the rate base. So, you know, and I could think of it, you know, if you're one generating asset on one feeder that has one, one load, you know, that's not going to be efficient market. But if that load is maxed out and you have a battery that's on that distribution line, you know, that load may be willing to pay something to be able to, you know, consume an extra 100 kilowatts above its, you know, 2 megawatt, you know, demand threshold than it would have before. And if you have a price infrastructure to price that, then you're going to enable opportunities where you wouldn't. And, you know, a one-in-one, type of market seems, you know, likely less relevant. But, maybe 50 market participants, of which 25 are loads, and, or, you know, 48 are loads and 2 are generators, you know, still gives you more opportunities to be able to price that and price those, and give, you know, the individual, the individual participants, you know, the ability to set their need more so than a bulk system
Yeah,
utility than you would otherwise be able to.
yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that brings up something that is yet another area of exploration here, which is, you know, when we're talking about doing things to like enable efficient operations, like how do you define efficiency? Operational efficiency, like true operational efficiency, may not be the most economically efficient kind of like model. Economic efficiency may not lead to the most efficient operation of the grid. So I think that's just another critical lens through which to look at this and other models of DER enablement. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for lending an hour of your day and for asking such thoughtful questions. I hope that this has been informative, and I very much encourage you to go explore the report, go read more about DSO models elsewhere, simply for the love of learning about different ways that DERs are treated and leveraged all around the world. So thank you guys very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Angela. Great
Thanks,
presentation.
Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol.